Another critically important characteristic of human skin is surface reflections, also referred to as specular reflections and also glossy reflections. And if we take a look at our skin detail reference image, there's evidence of specular reflection in every single photograph, to different degrees, but it's always there. And if you're like me, maybe you take specular reflections for granted. I certainly did in the first few years of my career, truly underestimating their power when it comes to realism. Back then, I wouldn't have necessarily assumed that every object has some level of specular reflection. But in this point in my career, I assume anything I'm creating has a specular reflection, only in the rare instances do I remove it completely. And skin is certainly not an exception. It may not be obvious to you yet, but at least the nose, you can see a pretty clear white highlight on the tip of the nose. But you can also see it on the forehead. It's a subtle reflection, but it's definitely a reflection. And nothing will make you more aware of this than trying to create a realistic portrait without a significant specular component. I think what makes this difficult is when we think of skin reflecting, we think of sweaty skin or we think of oily skin. But average neutral skin shouldn't be oily or sweaty. And that's true, but it doesn't mean there's no specular reflection. Let's take a look at another photograph here. This man's skin reads as neutral to me, not oily, not sweaty. But if we look at the forehead, there's clear evidence of reflecting the white sky. And it follows the entire way around the head, even into the nose, onto the cheek, of course, onto the lips, even onto the ear back here. Literally all of the skin is reflecting to some degree. Same with this guy over here. Being black and white, maybe it's a little easier to identify the reflections. But yeah, another example of reflections all over the skin surface. And again, maybe a little bit oily in terms of skin complexion, but certainly not overly oily and definitely not sweaty. And I could say the same things about every single photograph, but I want you to think differently about skin specularity. It's not primarily to determine oiliness or sweatiness, but think of it rather as a way to increase skin detail. Because we can control the creases in between our pore details to not reflect, and the areas in between those creases to reflect. And that will greatly increase the skin's surface quality, as we can see in this image. If you just focus on a little patch right here, it's almost like a noise texture. There's not any smooth, broad colors. It's extremely broken up, and the specular component is incredibly powerful for achieving this. But I will warn you that it's a very subtle exercise of adjusting various settings, various texture inputs to achieve a final result. So you will need practice. There's not a formula to get it right 100% the first time. But if you're interested in realistic portraits, you will want to take your time and practice achieving realistic surface reflections. So how about we pause the monologue, and first thing I want to do is render a 200% resolution image of our skin material as we have it currently, which means there are no specular variations in the material. It's just at a roughness of 0.5 and a specular level of 0.5. I want to make sure I'm on the first slot. So switch to slot 1 and just make sure my material is in the material output. Okay, and we'll render this. Okay, so let's compare this to our reference. I don't need the timeline for now. We'll minimize this, and I only need one image editor open. And if I'm honest, this doesn't look terrible. Even though the specular amount and specular roughness is universally consistent, which on principle is a detriment to realism, the sculpted geometric pore detail is doing a lot of work to make it look broken up. But there's a long way to go before it looks like our photos. And the way I like to start this is by converting our color data, right? So what we have going into our base color slot here. So if we go back to, let's switch to slot 2 for comparison and go to rendered view, and let's look at the color by itself. So we can take this data, which has pore evidence, wrinkle coloration, and convert it to a black and white map with a converter color ramp. All right, so we'll take this soft light, shift right click and drag to create a reroute node. Try and keep this as readable as possible because through this reflection creation process, we will add a lot more nodes to our network. So it's important to stay organized. And so shift control click on this color ramp. Let's think about how this will affect our specularity. Now, specifically, I want to focus on the roughness first, and then we'll come back to the specular amount. So the roughness, as you should know by now, controls how clear the reflections are. The lower values or the black colors will be very clear, like mirror reflections, although they're not metallic. So it's more like if you pour a bucket of water on your head, your skin would have purely black level roughness. And so as we look at this color data converted to black and white, the darker values surrounding the eye, around the lips, it gets darker. This would mean those areas are clearer reflections, which actually makes sense. We do tend to have concentration of reflections on the lips, especially if they've just been licked and they're wet, also on the nose and around the eyes. And so that's why we might as well start with the color data, because we have all this lovely detail that pushes the reflections in the right direction. It's not a complete solution by any means, unless you're just doing more of a quick portrait job and it's a background character, then you might be able to get away with it. But just as a beginning, let's plug it into our roughness slot. Shift-Control click on the principled BSDF. Now, the viewport we will not be able to trust anymore because our final render has so much more detail than what we're seeing in the viewport. So we really need to trust our values more than anything. And once you get used to this, you'll get a feel for what values should be what. But for this video, I want to kind of show you the ropes about how to navigate this. And so instead of black, that means that the clearest potential reflection in the skin can be completely wet feeling, and that's not what we want. So a level of 0 at the bottom flag is too low. So we should go more like, let's say 0.2 to start off. And if you don't know these values, you can unplug the roughness and then type the values in to get an idea. So at 0.5, it's middle of the road, not too shiny, not too dull. But then if we go to 0.2, it gets more shiny, a lot more shiny. And as we go above 0.5, let's say 0.8, it's extremely dull. It starts to look like diffuse, which is to say no specular reflection. And so 0.5 didn't look too bad where we were starting from. So let's take that white flag, and instead of a value of 1, which would be basically purely diffuse, let's take it down to 0.5. Now we have a better range to adjust our specular input. So with this established a bit better, let's plug it back into the roughness socket and do a comparison render to see how those values affect our specular reflection. Okay then, those are not the right values. He is way too sweaty, oily, shiny. That's okay, that's great information. We just need to adjust our values on the color flags. Let's go up by 0.1 on each. So the lower flag goes to 0.3, and the upper flag, let's take up to 0.6. Might seem like a small change, but it will have a pretty big effect. I'll just render over this because this is very far from what we want, so not worth keeping. Okay, that's looking better. Still a little bit on the sweaty, oily side, but we're getting there. Now, what I'm looking for is kind of the extremes in the spectrum. So the shiniest part around the lips, remember those were the darkest parts of the color ramp data. I think this reads pretty good like a lip. Again, though, that depends on how recently those lips were wetted. Like here, the lips don't really have a ton of difference compared to the rest of the skin, nor here. But on this guy, they do appear more reflective. But anyway, that to me reads like the clearest possible reflections I would need for anywhere on the face, which tells me the dark flag of 0.3 is a good value. Then on the other side, the dullest part of the skin is going to be the cheeks, and those feel pretty good too. But the point being that my extremes feel good, which leaves me to adjust the ramp flag positions, especially since I don't want it to look overly oily or wet. I want to bring down the light flag, so more of the high values enter the equation. So I'm going to bring that down to about halfway. Let's say position 0.5, and we'll do another render, but this time comparing. So we'll switch to slot 3. Okay, we've definitely left the oily zone with this, but almost a little too much. Like the lips, I don't know. I was going to say they lose a little bit of life. Maybe not. I definitely think the highest concentration of reflections, like around the eyes, the nose, and the lips most of the time, is a little on the dull side, but the majority of the skin feels pretty good. So maybe I just brought the flag down a little too far. Let's take it to like 0.7, the high flag, and see what that does. All right. This is feeling more balanced to me. So this is a little on the dull side. This is too shiny, and this feels in the middle. Too shiny, in the middle. Now let's jump forward. So I'm on slot 4. This is the last frame that I've rendered. But if I hit J, it'll jump all the way back to the beginning, which is completely uniform spec. And then Alt-J will go back to 4. So when I see that, I get really excited. The skin just feels like it has more life. I understand if it's a little subtle for you if you're new to this, but we're definitely not done. We are in the right direction, though, which I feel good about. So we've been dealing with roughness so far, but we also have specular amount. Let's switch to slot 5 and discuss how we address that using the same color ramp approach. So I'm going to move this down, making room for another color ramp. Shift-D, I'll duplicate it up, and then hit the backspace key to reset it. Shift, right-click, and drag a new reroute node, connecting that to our color. Must be too close. There we go. And shift control click on this. So it's the same input we've already done, but think about how specular amount works. So dark values mean no specularity, light values mean high specularity. So I actually need to reverse the color ramp. The lips are dark, which means they'll reflect less, and that's not what I want. I actually want the opposite. Similar to the eyes. With the color ramp in default position, the eyes would be less reflective, and we want the opposite. So down arrow, flip the color ramp. And then think about the value we have there already. 0.5 was a pretty good value. Most of the time, 0.5 is a little on the high side. I like to hover between 0.2, 0.3 usually. But so far, 0.5 has proven itself a decent value. So it's reasonable to make our bright flag 0.5 instead of 1. And then the dark flag, we'll leave that at black. The idea being that potentially there could be spots of the skin with very low reflection. And often I like to crunch these values a little bit more, so bring them closer together. Kind of analyze what that will give us. All right, so this puts the lips as very reflective, or our highest value of 0.5, and the area around the eyes similarly. But the best part is throughout the whole head, we get this variety that will break up the amount of reflections. And so let's see what this looks like plugged into specular and do a render. Make sure that I'm in a new slot. Okay, I am. Okay, that's feeling pretty balanced to me. Let's see before and after. All right, so keep an eye on the eyes. The reflections didn't change hardly at all. All right, so this is before, this is after. Now take a look at the cheeks. Before, a little bit shinier, and after, a little dimmer. Same thing with the lips. They stay the same before and after, but the skin surrounding the lips goes from higher reflectivity to lower reflectivity. So we're making good strides in terms of controlling and fine-tuning our surface reflections, but there's still some key things we're going to do in the next video. For now, I'm going to run through renders of various lighting scenarios to see how it holds up. All right, let's shuffle through 4 lighting scenarios. Here's the first one, second one, third, and fourth. And overall, I'm happy with it. I think the specularity holds up in each scenario, but these first 2, the reflection seems more apparent. Like clearly in the cheek, the way the light's hitting, I can see the reflectivity. It's pretty low on the nose, actually pretty low on the nose in all of these renders. But then in the third and fourth slots, I barely see any reflection on the majority of the skin. It's pretty much concentrated only in the eyes and the lips. So I might want to bump that up a bit, and maybe even on a per render basis. Once I get to our final renders, you know, we always reserve the right to be able to adjust these right up until the end. But overall, I'm happy with the direction our specular reflections are going. In the next video, we're going to add a couple more components to push it even further.